Git pull force, how to overwrite local changes with Git. When you learn to code, sooner or later you'll also learn about version control systems. And while there are many competing tools in this space, one of them is the de facto standard used by almost everyone in the industry. It's so popular that there are companies that use its name in the branding. We're talking about Git, of course. While Git is a powerful tool, its power is well hidden. There are some essential concepts that you need to understand to become really proficient with Git. The good news is that once you learn them, you'll hardly ever run into trouble you can't escape from. In a typical Git workflow, you'll use a local repository, a remote repository, and one or more branches. Repositories store all the information about the project, including its entire history and all the branches. A branch is basically a collection of changes leading from an empty project to the current state. After cloning a repository, you work on your local copy and introduce new changes, until you push local changes to the remote repository. All your work is available only on your machine. When you finish a task, it's time to synchronize with the remote repository. You want to pull the remote changes to keep up with the project's progress. And you want to push the local changes to share your work with others. All is well when you and the rest of your team are working on totally separate files. Whatever happens, you won't be stepping on each other's feet. However, there are times when you and your teammates simultaneously introduce changes in the same place. And that's usually where the problems begin. Have you ever executed git pull only to see the dreaded error? Your local changes to the following files would be overwritten by merge. Sooner or later, everyone runs into that problem. What's more confusing here is that you don't want to merge anything. Just pull. Right. Actually, pull is a bit more complicated than you might have thought. Pull is not a single operation. It consists of fetching data from the remote server and then merging the changes with the local repository. These two operations can be performed manually if you want, since Git only performs merges when there are no uncommitted changes. Every time you run git pull with uncommitted changes could get you into trouble. Fortunately, there are ways to get out of trouble in one piece. When you have uncommitted local changes and still want to pull a new version from the remote server, your use case typically falls into one of the following scenarios. Either, in this case, you just want to drop all the uncommitted local changes. Perhaps you modified a file to experiment, but you no longer need the modification. All you care about is being up to date with the upstream. This means that you add one more step between fetching the remote changes and merging them. This step will reset the branch to its unmodified state, thus allowing git merge to work. Git merge origin, current branch if you don't want to type the branch name every time you run this command. Git has a nice shortcut pointing to the upstream branch, @u. An upstream branch is the branch in the remote repository that you push to and fetch from. Git merge, @u. We are quoting the shortcut in the example to prevent the shell from interpreting it. When your uncommitted changes are significant to you, there are two options. You can commit them and then perform git pull, or you can stash them. Stashing means putting the changes away for a moment to bring them back later. To be more precise, git stash creates a commit that is not visible on your current branch, but is still accessible by Git. To bring back the changes saved in the last stash, you use the git stash pop command. After successfully applying the stashed changes, this command also removes the stash commit as it is no longer needed. Git stash pop by default. The changes from the stash will become stage. If you want to unstage them, use the command git restore stage if using Git newer than 2.25.0. The last scenario is a little different from the previous ones. Let's say that you are in the middle of a very messy refactoring. Neither losing the changes nor stashing them is an option. Yet, you still want to have the remote changes available to run git diff against them. As you have probably figured out, downloading the remote changes does not require git pull at all. Git fetch is just enough. One thing to note is that by default, git fetch will only bring you changes from the current branch. To get all the changes from all the branches, use git fetch all. And if you'd like to clean up some of the branches that no longer exist in the remote repository, git fetch all prune will do the cleaning up. Have you heard of git config? It's a file where Git stores all of the user-configured settings. It resides in your home directory, either as gitconfig or config git config. You can edit it to add some custom aliases that will be understood as Git commands. For example, to have a shortcut equivalent to git diff cached that shows the difference between the current branch and the staged files, you'd add the following section: dc equals diff cached. After that, you can run git dc whenever you wish to review the changes. Going this way, we can set up a few aliases related to the previous use cases. Pull stash equals git fetch all git stash, git merge at u, git stash pop. This way, running git pull force will overwrite the local changes, while git pull stash will preserve them. Curious minds may have already discovered that there is such a thing as git pull force. However, this is a very different beast to what's presented in this article. It may sound like something that would help us overwrite local changes. Instead, it lets us fetch the changes from one remote branch to a different local branch. Git pull force only modifies the behavior of the fetching part. It is therefore equivalent to git fetch force. Like git push, git fetch allows us to specify which local and remote branch we want to operate on. Git fetch origin, feature 1, my feature will mean that the changes in the feature 1 branch from the remote repository will end up visible on the local branch my feature. When such an operation modifies the existing history, it is not permitted by Git without an explicit force parameter. Just like git push force allows overwriting remote branches, git fetch force or git pull force allows overwriting local branches. It is always used with source and destination branches mentioned as parameters. An alternative approach to overwriting local changes using git pull force could be git pull force at u head. The world of Git is vast. This article covered only one of the facets of repository maintenance, incorporating remote changes into a local repository. Even this everyday scenario required us to look slightly more in depth into this version control tool's internal mechanisms. Learning actual use cases helps you better understand how Git works under the hood. This, in turn, will make you feel empowered whenever you get yourself into trouble. We all do that from time to time. Learn to code for free. FreeCodeCamp's open source curriculum has helped more than 40,000 people get jobs as text source, freecodecamp.org.